14 people died in 12 months following the exact same instruction. Not different mistakes, not 14 unrelated failures. The same rule, taught in the same courses, followed almost to the letter, and in every recorded case, it was the last decision they made before the timeline ended. This file is not about people who ignored survival training. It is about people who followed it precisely, and about the moment a rule designed to save lives quietly stops working without ever announcing that it has changed. The pattern does not appear in a single environment or a single type of emergency. It shows up in mountain rescues, maritime cases, and desert search files alike, which is part of what makes it difficult to see as a pattern at all. Each case on its own looks like an isolated tragedy rather than a recurring failure of the same underlying assumption. The question this file keeps returning to is simple. What is the exact moment a rule designed to save a life stops protecting a person and starts working against them? If you want more dark survival files like this, subscribe now, leave a like so this reaches the people who need it, and comment which case should be investigated next. In the next few minutes, 4 things will become clear. Why the most repeated survival rule in modern training also appears most often in fatal case files. What separates a rule that saves a life from the same rule that ends one? Why trained people sometimes make worse decisions under pressure than untrained people? And what the record shows about the moment a rule needs to be broken instead of followed. The first piece of evidence is uncomfortable. Across multiple rescue timelines, the rule most frequently cited in survival courses, stay with your shelter, your vehicle, or your last known position, appears in both the highest number of successful rescues and, separately, in a disturbing number of fatal case files. The rule is not wrong, but the case files show it was never designed to be followed unconditionally, and somewhere between the classroom and the field, the conditions attached to it were lost. Investigators note that the original version of this guidance, as taught in most formal courses, always included qualifiers, sufficient shelter, stable injuries, a confirmed rescue timeline, that tend to disappear by the time the rule reaches casual repetition among hikers, campers, and weekend adventurers who never took the full course themselves. Here is what the record shows. In several recovered case files, victims who stayed exactly where instructed died of exposure, within reach of a working vehicle, a marked trail, or visible ridgeline, not because staying was the wrong choice in general, but because staying stopped being the right choice hours before they stopped moving. Temperature had dropped further than expected, injuries had progressed, daylight had run out faster than the rule accounted for. The instruction remained the same. The situation it was built for did not. The same pattern shows up in other classic instructions taught across different survival disciplines. Follow moving water downhill to find civilization appears in multiple fatal case files involving terrain where the water led into gorges, waterfalls, or dense floodplain rather than toward any road or settlement. Signal 3 times in a pattern of 3 appears in case files where survivors exhausted their only flare or whistle on a fixed schedule instead of adjusting the pattern once they had visual or audible confirmation that a search team was nearby. In each case, the rule was sound advice for a general scenario. The case files show it becoming fatal only once someone applied it without checking whether their specific terrain, timing, or resources still matched the scenario the rule was written for. But knowing the rule is not enough. You need to know when the rule fails. There is a second contradiction buried in these files, and it goes farther than any single instruction. Training itself changes how people respond to changing conditions, and not always for the better. In several case files, trained individuals took longer to deviate from a memorized protocol than untrained individuals facing the same emergency because the untrained person had no rule to defend and simply reacted to what they saw in front of them.
Be prepared for any crisis. The Self-Sufficient Backyard is a practical guide to food production and preservation, water storage, off-grid energy, and backyard projects. Use the link in the description to discover methods suited to your space. Now, back to the video's topic.
Investigators reviewing these files describe a specific mechanism behind this delay. A rule learned through repetition becomes attached to a sense of competence. Following it correctly feels like proof of preparation, and abandoning it, even for good reason, can feel like admitting the training failed. Several debriefs describe survivors who recognized in real time that their situation had changed and who nonetheless continued following the original plan for a significant stretch afterward simply because they could not yet reconcile breaking the rule with still being someone who knows what they're doing. This raises a harder question than which rule is correct. It raises the question search and rescue investigators keep circling back to without a clean answer. Why do prepared people sometimes fail exactly where their preparation should have protected them? This brings us back to where we started. The exact moment a survival rule stops protecting a person is not a single dramatic event. According to the pattern across these case files, it is the moment new information arrives, a temperature drop, a worsening injury, a missed rescue window, and the person chooses the rule over the information anyway. The cases that ended differently share a specific detail. The survivors did not abandon their training. They treated every rule as conditional from the start, built around a simple internal check. Does the situation in front of me still match the situation this rule was built for? When the answer changed, so did their decision, without treating that change as a failure of discipline. Here is what the record shows about that internal check specifically. In recovered debriefs, survivors who reassessed their position at fixed intervals, roughly every hour, regardless of how confident they felt, caught deteriorating conditions significantly earlier than those who reassessed only when something felt obviously wrong. By the time something felt wrong, in several cases, hours of usable daylight, warmth, or energy had already been spent on a plan that no longer fit. This detail matters because it separates two very different survival postures that can look identical from the outside. One person following a rule and one person applying judgment through the same rule can make the exact same decision in the first hour of an emergency. The difference only becomes visible later, at the point where conditions shift and one of them adjusts while the other keeps executing the original instruction on schedule. Case files repeatedly show the adjusting group reaching safety in situations that on paper looked identical to fatal ones. There is a further detail in these files that rarely appears in general safety guidance: the specific reasoning survivors gave afterward for breaking a rule they had been taught to follow without exception. Across separate, unrelated accounts, a similar phrase recurs: the rule assumed things that weren't true anymore. That phrase marks the difference between someone applying a rule and someone applying judgment, using the rule only as a starting point rather than a final answer. Consider one recovered account, reconstructed from a search and rescue debrief. A hiker became disoriented after a sudden storm reduced visibility on a marked ridge trail. Following training, he stayed near the last cairn he could identify, expecting search teams to search that exact section based on his last known route. Hours passed. Temperature dropped well below what his gear was rated for, and the storm showed no sign of clearing. He waited nearly 6 hours before reconsidering, held in place by the same instruction that had likely saved other hikers in other conditions. When he finally moved, he did so not because the rule had failed in general, but because he recognized his specific situation no longer matched it: declining body temperature, a storm with no clear end, and no confirmed rescue timeline. He located a rock overhang roughly 200 meters downslope, built a windbreak using his pack and emergency bivvy, and waited out the worst of the storm in partial shelter instead of fully exposed terrain. He was recovered the following afternoon, hypothermic but stable, at the overhang rather than at his last known cairn. A detail search teams later noted made the recovery faster, not slower, because his change in position was consistent with the kind of shelter-seeking behavior their protocols already anticipated. Investigators specifically noted that his decision to move only 200 meters rather than attempting to descend the entire ridge kept him within a radius their search pattern still covered, the difference in their assessment between a reasonable deviation and an uncontrolled one. Why do prepared people sometimes fail exactly where their preparation should have protected them? A second, unrelated case file offers a mirrored answer from the opposite direction. A backcountry skier caught in a similar whiteout abandoned his position too early before conditions had genuinely become unsurvivable based on a different rule entirely: keep moving to stay warm. He left a location search teams were actively closing in on based on a beacon signal and moved into terrain that broke the signal entirely. His reasoning, reconstructed afterward, mirrored the hikers almost exactly, only pointed in the opposite direction. He believed his position was already lost to the storm, and that movement was the only variable left in his control. The case file notes that his beacon had continued transmitting clearly for at least 90 minutes after he left, meaning the rescue that eventually found him could have arrived considerably sooner had he simply reassessed his actual risk level rather than acting on a general instruction to keep moving regardless of circumstance. He was recovered 2 days later, in worse condition than he would have been had he simply stayed those first few additional hours, with frostbite injuries that further complicated his return to the trailhead once found. Both cases involved a rule, applied with genuine training and good intention. Both cases involved a moment where the rule and the situation stopped matching. Only one of the two people noticed the mismatch in time. A third file, briefer than the other two, adds a final layer to the pattern. A group of 3 hikers following the same stay together instruction taught in nearly every group survival course remained together even after one member's injury made travel significantly slower for the entire group. The rule assumed that staying together improved everyone's odds, true in most conditions, but not once darkness and dropping temperature meant that the uninjured pair could have reached a known rescue point well before nightfall on their own. They stayed anyway, and all 3 were eventually recovered safely, but with a delay investigators attributed directly to a rule applied without reconsidering whether splitting temporarily, with one person going for help, had become the safer option once the timeline changed. The outcome in this case was survival for everyone, but the case file was flagged specifically because the margin for a different outcome had been far narrower than anyone in the group realized at the time. The ancient record goes silent here, but the lesson remains. A rule is not wrong because it eventually fails. It fails because it was never meant to run without a check attached to it, an ongoing comparison between the world the rule assumes and the world actually in front of the person following it. That check does not require abandoning training. It requires treating every instruction as a hypothesis about current conditions, not a fixed law independent of them. Asking at regular intervals whether the assumptions behind the rule still hold, and being willing to act on the answer even when it contradicts what was taught. The rule remains useful. It simply stops being the whole answer the moment conditions move past what it was written to handle. 14 people followed the same rule in the same year, and none of them survived, not because the rule was wrong, but because none of them asked in time whether it still applied to them.